Hey Lifers, Dustin here, and we are now 11 weeks through the college football season, so it's time for another edition of the Eliminator. Last week, or coming into this past week, we had 10 teams still vying for the Final Four in the college football playoff. How many of those went down? And I'm adding multiple teams back to the Eliminator for the first time this season. Find out which teams are raising from the dead, so definitely make sure to stay tuned for that. And as always, after we finish the national playoff edition of the Eliminator, make sure to check out down in the comments section for the timestamps for individual divisions and conferences. If you're into that, I would really like you to watch the whole video, but if you only care about a couple of conferences or divisions, I understand. Timestamps are down in the comments section. Now remember, we already have eliminated the CUSA, the MAC, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt. The ACC came in with two teams in Miami and Clemson. Both took care of business, though Miami looked way better when it did it. These two teams will officially meet in Charlotte, with the winner likely in the playoff if both teams can win out until then. The Big Ten came in with only Wisconsin left, and they soundly beat Iowa 38-14. But I'm bringing back Ohio State. Yes, Wisconsin just beat Iowa 38-14. That's the same Iowa team that last week destroyed Ohio State. But as much as I hate bringing teams back, here we are. If Auburn and Alabama still lose, the Big Ten champion will likely make the playoff. For that reason, Ohio State, the leading team in the East, is de-eliminated because a win versus Illinois and Michigan, which is expected right now, will send the Buckeyes to Indianapolis. I'm not doing the same thing with Penn State unless the Badgers lose to Michigan, which Wisconsin shouldn't do considering they just locked up their very first 10-0 start in school history. The Big 12 came in with two teams. We knew the loser of Oklahoma and TCU would be eliminated, and that was emphatically TCU. In my opinion, that leaves only Oklahoma left. TCU and Oklahoma State have two losses, both in conference, meaning TCU is the favorite to play Oklahoma again in the Big 12 championship game. If Oklahoma loses, I think the Big 12 is out of the race. Speaking of being out of the race, let's look at the Pac-12. They came in last week with only Washington alive, and they lost to Friday to Stanford. That eliminates the Huskies and the entire Pac-12 with it. There's still a faint chance, I guess, with some chaos at the top, that USC can get in, but I don't think there's enough yet. And with that, I'm officially eliminating the entire Pac-12, an entire Power 5 conference, from their third playoff in 4 years. The SEC came in with Alabama and Georgia left, but obviously Auburn had the chance to be in the playoffs now with wins against Alabama and Georgia. With that, and with their win against Georgia, I am de-eliminating the Auburn Tigers. It's absolutely incredible that they were able to fight back into the title race after the loss to LSU. They looked not in a good position to get in the playoff, and I eliminated them after that loss. But here they are with a win against Alabama and beating Georgia again in the SEC championship game. It's almost assured that Auburn will get into the playoff. Into the Independence we go, and Notre Dame had a 1-point loss to Georgia early in the season that looked like the best loss in the country until both teams lost this weekend. Their destruction at the hands of Miami sends the Irish likely to the Orange Bowl, but not to the playoff. And the American, UCF, keeps plugging along with a 49-24 win against UConn to stay undefeated. Temple and USF remain between the Knights and a New Year's Six Bowl, likely in the Peach Bowl. Unless, of course, Memphis has something to say about that. So we came into this week with 10 teams remaining, and we eliminated 3 of those teams. But we are not down to 7. In fact, we put Ohio State and Auburn back up, so now we're back up to 9 teams. Of those 9 teams, 4 are undefeated, 4 are Power 5 one-loss teams, and then, of course, 2 lost Auburn. No official eliminator games this weekend, but if Clemson, Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, or UCF or Oklahoma have a hiccup and lose, they're done. Of these 9 teams, all of them except for Oklahoma and UCF will face each other at some point. The conferences include the SEC with 3, the ACC and Big Ten with 2 apiece, Oklahoma and UCF. Now it's time for conferences. Remember that all the stats down in the conferences are going to be conferences only. I'm not talking about non-conference games, and I'm not showing their overall record, just conference. We'll start where it's the easiest, with the ACC. Clemson and Miami both clinched their divisions. They will meet in Charlotte on December 2nd. The Big Ten East is a little bit harder to figure out right now. Currently, Ohio State sits at the top at 6-1, but 3 5-2 teams trail them. They've beaten both Michigan State and Penn State, but a loss against Michigan would trigger a possible tiebreaker scenario. If Ohio State and Wisconsin both win this weekend, Ohio State will clinch the East title since they've already beaten two-loss Michigan State and Penn State, and will have a tiebreaker over both of them. If Michigan wins, Ohio State needs to win out. In the West, Wisconsin has already clinched their spot in Indianapolis. They will face the winner of the East. In the Big 12, it is starting to get a little dicey down the stretch. You have Oklahoma sitting up top at 6-1 with games at Kansas and against West Virginia left. West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and TCU are at 5-2, but Oklahoma has already defeated TCU and Oklahoma State, and really is in a very similar position to Ohio State out of the Big Ten East. If they lose to West Virginia, they will trigger a tiebreaker, assuming all the other teams win out. But there's a chance they would still win the tiebreaker after beating two of those teams and probably still being the highest ranked among them. For Oklahoma to get to the Big 12 championship, all they need to do is win out. West Virginia needs to win out and have TCU or Oklahoma State lose each. TCU needs to win out. Oklahoma State needs to win out and have TCU lose. To be honest with you, math has never been my strong suit, so I'm not too sure mathematically, but Texas and Iowa State, I just can't see either of them getting up into the top two, so I did officially eliminate them. We'll actually start with the Pac-12 South before the Pac-12 North to show you that USC clinched. So that's done. We can move on now to the Pac-12 North, where you have Washington State at 6-2, Stanford at 6-2, and Washington at 5-2 left. Now, Washington State gets a bye before the Washington game. Stanford has Cal before Notre Dame. And Washington still has Utah and Washington State both at home. If Washington State beats Washington, they will win the North. They will face USC in the title game. If they lose to the Huskies, Stanford and Washington win out. Stanford will actually play the Trojans in a rematch. If all three teams somehow finish 6-3, I got to the fourth tiebreaker on the Pac-12's website, which would be the team's records against Oregon or Cal, whoever finishes higher. Kind of crazy, so let's hope it doesn't come down to that. In the SEC East, Georgia, of course, clinched even with the loss to Auburn. They had already clinched coming into that game. The West is down to one game. You have Alabama at Auburn. Auburn versus Alabama. The winner of the Iron Bowl will face Georgia in Atlanta for a playoff berth, it looks like at this point. Going down to the Group of 5 level in the American East, UCF and USF are the only teams that I see still vying for a conference championship, or at least a division championship. UCF at 6-0 travels up to Philly and then hosts the Bulls. USF hosts Tulsa and then travels to Orlando. So it looks like the war for I-4 between UCF and USF will determine the American East Championship. If UCF wins this weekend and USF loses, it will officially clinch it for the Knights. In the West, Memphis at 5-1 and Houston at 4-2 sit atop, and the only two teams still vying for the West Championship. Memphis does have a win over Houston, which is huge. They host SMU and East Carolina, while Houston travels to Tulane and hosts Navy. A Memphis win against SMU wins the West, or a Houston loss. In the CUSA East, FAU, undefeated in the conference, sits atop FIU with 2 losses. They play this weekend. If FAU wins against FIU, they officially clinch the East. They will take on North Texas out of the West. If they lose and beat Charlotte, who is currently 1-5 in conference play, they still win the division. If FAU loses to FIU and Charlotte, FIU wins out. The Panthers will win, though that is unlikely. And as I said, the CUSA West has already been won by North Texas, which is pretty impressive, only a few years after a 1-11 season. In the MAC East, we have a huge game this week between Ohio, who travels out to Akron. Those two teams are the only two teams vying for the East, and that will essentially be a MAC East championship game, assuming both teams would win their last 2 games, but Buffalo and Kent State are at the bottom of the division, so that does seem likely. The winner of Ohio-Akron will probably be the East champion. If Ohio or Akron win out, they win. If Ohio beats Akron, they officially clinch. The West is a little more complicated, but not by much. Toledo and Northern Illinois sit at the top at 5-1. Central Michigan and Western Michigan are right below them at 4-2, still statistically in the race. If Toledo wins out, they win the West. NIU needs to win out and have Toledo lose again. Not sure what happens if those 4 end at 6-2. Probably a Western Michigan edge, but I'm not entirely certain. Again, I'm not great at mathematics. In the Mountain West, the 2 teams sitting at the top are Boise State at 6-0 and Wyoming at 5-1. Both teams still have to play Fresno State, who leads the West right now. A Boise win wins them the division. So does a Wyoming loss. So if Boise beats Air Force and Wyoming loses to the Bulldogs, that's a wrap. Boise State wins the division. Wyoming needs Boise to lose out, and Wyoming needs to win out in order to go to the conference championship. If you look at the Mountain West, Fresno State sits at the top at 5-1. San Diego State's at 4-2, and UNLV at 3-3. Fresno State wins the West with a win. So if they beat Wyoming or Boise State, they clinch the division. Those are the two toughest games in the conference left to play, though. If San Diego State wins out and Fresno loses out, the Aztecs win the West. If Fresno and San Diego State both lose out, it's a three-way tie with UNLV. If Fresno or San Diego State win, the Rebels are officially eliminated no matter what. And finally, we look at the craziness that is the Sun Belt with 12 teams and no divisions this year. Sitting at the top in a three-way tie is Troy, Georgia State, and App State, all with 5-1 records. Arkansas State has played one less game and is sitting there at 4-1, with UL Lafayette at 3-2. Georgia State, App State, basically an elimination game. Still a lot of chaos left, and with no conference championship game, we may not find out who the official winner or winners, if there's a tie, is until December 2nd. So that's it for this week's Eliminator. Definitely make sure to let me know down in the comment section which teams you think are going out this weekend, either at the national or the conference level. Things are starting to get crazy. It's the end of the year. All the games mean so much more than they would have if these same games would have been played at the beginning of the year because of the implications of what could or could not happen. And I haven't even put out the bowl eligibility video yet, but those are really important in some of those games as well. So let me know down below in the comments section which teams are going out this week. And boy, things are starting to get crazy at the national level, aren't they? Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. You can also click the circle right there in order to subscribe or watch any of the other videos over there to the right that YouTube has suggested for you. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, until next time. Wisconsin left, and they soundly beat Iowa 38-14, but I'm bringing back Ohio State. Yes, Wisconsin just beat Iowa 38-14. That's the same Iowa team that last week destroyed Ohio State, but as much as I hate bringing teams back, here we are. If Auburn and Alabama still lose, the Big Ten champion will likely make the playoff, and timestamps are down in the comment section. Now remember, we already have eliminated the CUSA, the MAC, the Mountain West, and the Sun Belt. The ACC came in with two teams in Miami and Clemson. Both took care of business, though Miami looked way better when it did it. These two teams will officially meet in Charlotte, with the winner likely in the playoff if both teams can win out until then. The Big Ten came in with only. For that reason, Ohio State, the leading team in the East, is de-eliminated because a win versus Illinois and Michigan, which is expected right now, will send the Buckeyes to Indianapolis. I'm not doing the same thing with Penn State unless the Badgers lose to Michigan, which Wisconsin shouldn't do considering they just locked up their very first 10-0 start in school history. The Big 12 came in with two teams. We knew the Eliminator for the first time this season. Find out which teams are raising from the dead, so definitely make sure to stay tuned for that. And as always, after we finish the national playoff edition of the Eliminator, make sure to check out down in the comments section for the timestamps for individual divisions and conferences. If you're into that, I would really like you to watch the whole video, but if you only care about a couple of conferences or divisions, I understand. Hey Lifers, Dustin here, and we are now 11 weeks through the college football season, so it's time for another edition of the Eliminator. Last week, or coming into this past week, we had 10 teams still vying for the Final Four in the college football playoff. How many of those went down? And I'm adding multiple teams back to the Eliminator.